Hey guys, it's Rick Crawley with Achilles Heel Tactical, and today we're here to bring you 5 tips to improve your trigger control. All right, so what is trigger control? Trigger control is defined as the skillful manipulation of taking this trigger from point A to point B without disrupting the sights. But not just the execution, also the resetting of that trigger in flight of cycle of operations. So tip number 1. Placement of the finger on the trigger. From the tip of the finger to that first joint, I want to cut that area right in half. So right where I place my mark is exactly where I want to find that finger on the trigger. From there, that's setting me up for success in isolating this joint and building my grip from the trigger back. So tip number 1 is placement. Finding that placement is crucial. I understand that I could pull this trigger with my pinky, my middle finger, turn the gun upside down and pull it with whatever finger. As long as I don't disrupt the sights, that shot is going to go where it's intended. But from the consistency of draw, I want to have that same exact placement and prep on the way out. That way I'm having the same exact trigger press every single time I draw this pistol with the intent to fire. All right, tip number 2, isolation from a single joint. When I manipulate this trigger straight back into the rear, I do not want to be breaking from 2 joints. As I break from 2 joints, as you can see, the mark on my finger is actually pointing over my dominant side shoulder, throwing left and right horizontal influence on the gun. As a right-handed shooter, by me pulling this trigger, I'm taking the nose of the gun left, deviating the sights left. A lot of the times, this is when we break that trigger using 4 fingers instead of just isolating from a single joint. This is why we're finding those low and left shots as a right-handed shooter, and then vice versa for a left-handed shooter, those low and right shots. So by isolating a single joint, I take my finger straight out and I isolate like a lever straight back. So I bring that finger straight back from an isolated joint. That way I have a 90-degree approach. And as you can see, when I bring this mark back, I'm staring at the mark because it's coming straight to my diaphragm. I want to be bringing that trigger as straight back as humanly possible. So tip number 2, isolate from a single joint straight back into the rear. All right, so tip number 3, interrupted trigger press versus non-interrupted trigger press. Ideally, when I'm in my sights, I want to have the most interruption within that trigger press from A to B so that I don't disrupt the sights and the round goes exactly where it's intended to go. In interrupted trigger press, what that looks like, when I find placement, I isolate from a singular joint, building my grip from the trigger back on that dominant side hand. I'm going to come from point A to the wall. Just call that point B. From point B at the wall, I want to add steady pressure, and as I'm adding steady pressure, I'm starting to feel slight creep or movement. From those positions, I need to find how much creep or movement I have from wall to bang, and understand within that moment of interrupted trigger press where after the wall my round is going off. All right, so again, that interrupted trigger press is going to give you the best results when trying to not deviate your sights from your target that you intend to engage. All right, so a non-interrupted trigger press. When would we use something like that? A non-interrupted trigger press is from placement to bang, immediately, having the most disruption in the sights. So when would we use something like that is when we're not actually in our sights, something like a pectoral close quarter retention drill where we're now needing to engage a target from point blank distance, where I'm no longer needing to be in my sights and I have no sights to disrupt. It's from A to B, that point blank distance, where I'm now able to break a shot immediately because I have the gun locked in my body positioning. So interrupted versus non-interrupted trigger press is tip number 3. All right, tip number 4, understanding your trigger. This is something that I really focus on in my classes, getting students understanding their trigger, what type. So with an AR, you have your single stage and 2-stage triggers. With your striker fired guns, it's extremely important in order to be accountable with this weapon to actually understand when that sear is being disengaged. So where we find sear engagement? From here at full extension to the wall, all the creep like we talked about and all that movement past the wall. We want to identify how much movement is from past the wall. So I come to the wall, my trigger moves once, my trigger moves twice, and we heard sear engagement. From that point, I would do this over and over again, dry. Then I would come up on target. I would draw present from full extension of that trigger to wall, and then from that position, adding steady pressure, 1, 2. So what I would say, my gun is a 2-count gun. That way, when I load up and make ready, and I come up and settle my sights out on target, I'm coming up, coming to the wall, finding position past wall, stop number 1 and then executing on stop number 2, but never telling the gun exactly what to do, putting the least amount of human influence into the gun, just letting the gun do what it was designed to do. All right, so that's going to give you the best results as far as not disrupting the sight, is know when the trigger and the sear engagement's going to happen. Don't be guessing. We're not coming out to the range and letting it surprise us. We're actually understanding and we're educated on our triggers, exactly when that sear is going to be engaged. All right, that was tip number 4. Now moving to tip number 5. All right, so tip number 5, the skillful resetting of this trigger. When we break this shot without disrupting the sights in the most interrupted manner, this gun is going to cycle, and within the cycle of operations, we want to reduce the pressure I have exerted on that trigger finger so that it is now reset, and I'm no longer, when in the follow-through steps, waiting on this trigger to be reset to then go bang again. All right, so again, nice and slow here. When I'm resetting this trigger, as I skillfully manipulate this trigger to the rear in the most interrupted fashion to not disrupt the sights. When that shot breaks, sear engages, the cycle of operation now ensues on this gun. It cycles and I reduce the pressure I have exerted on the trigger so that it brings it to a sear reset point. No longer am I pinning this trigger back to the rear, allowing it to cycle. Now the gun is waiting on me. I have to now bring it forward, and as you hear that click, I now have to take up all those stops of movement back to the rear to go bang again. What that's going to do is now make it harder on the rounds 2, 3, 4, and 5 to settle the sight, and also add repeatability within the consistency of trigger press. What you're doing is now pulling through extra slack within that trigger because you broke, and then reset at the wall. By resetting at the wall, what that's doing is giving you extra steps to now take up, and most of the time you're probably not even doing it. So on rounds 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and however so on and so forth, you're just pulling through and now deviating the sights even more. All right guys, these 5 tips, they don't just apply to the pistol that I've been demonstrating on, they also apply to the rifle. All right, so like on a 2-stage trigger, like what's in this rifle, as I add steady pressure, getting the most interrupted trigger press as I possibly can, I find myself at the wall. From this position, I add steady pressure and break that shot. Now, when the gun cycles, if I pin this trigger back to the rear and I reduce pressure after the cycle of operations, I get that click and then I find that creep again. That is what you are now pulling through, and what I was explaining, you're pulling through on rounds 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the follow-on shots, which are inherently already harder. So what I want to do is in-flight reset. So in the cycle of operations of this rifle, as this rifle cycles, my finger reduces pressure exerted on the trigger, immediately resetting that trigger to then go bang. As you guys are seeing, the trigger is resetting now in flight of cycle of operations. What I'm not doing is breaking the trigger, pinning it to the rear, then having to take up all that slack just to go bang again. Cycle of operations, in-flight resetting of that trigger, not coming off the trigger and then coming back on, playing catch and trying to find the reset in the most inconsistent way, because now we're having irregular placement on that trigger. All right guys, I hope these 5 tips really help you guys within your journey to become accountable, proficient shooters. Trigger control is very important, and it's something that takes work. It's a skillful manipulation of that trigger, not just the execution, but also the resetting of it. It's not going to come overnight, and there's plenty of isolation drills that you can find within my classes in order to master your trigger.